Welcome to Sleepy Science Odyssey. Tonight, ancient Egypt, a civilization that flourished along the Nile River for over 3,000 years, building monuments that still stand today, developing systems of writing and mathematics, practicing medicine and engineering, worshipping gods with animal heads, and preserving their dead for eternity. We'll move slowly through the dynasties and kingdoms, exploring the pyramids and temples, the pharaohs and priests, the daily life and death rituals, the achievements in science and art that defined one of history's most enduring civilizations. If you're new here, this channel is for people who need something to think about before they can stop thinking. Real history, no dramatization, just quiet facts in the dark. Let's begin. Ancient Egypt lasted for approximately 3,000 years. The civilization's conventional timeline begins around 3100 BCE with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and ends in 30 BCE when Cleopatra VII died and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. To put this in perspective, ancient Egypt lasted longer than the time between the fall of Rome and today. The pyramids were as ancient to Cleopatra as Cleopatra is to us. About 2,500 years separated her from the pyramid builders. During these 3 millennia, Egypt experienced periods of stability and prosperity called kingdoms, separated by intermediate periods of political fragmentation and foreign rule. The Old Kingdom, roughly 2680–621 81 BCE, was the age of pyramid building. The Middle Kingdom, approximately 2050–51650 BCE, was a period of cultural renaissance and territorial expansion. The New Kingdom, around 1550–1077 BCE, was Egypt's imperial age, when it controlled vast territories and built the great temples at Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel. Between these kingdoms were intermediate periods, times of political instability, civil war, and foreign invasion. Despite these disruptions, Egyptian civilization maintained remarkable continuity. The same gods were worshipped, the same writing system used, and many of the same customs observed from the earliest dynasties through to the Ptolemaic period. This continuity is extraordinary when you consider how much the world changed during those 3,000 years. When the first pyramids were being built, most of the world's people were still living in small agricultural villages or as nomadic hunter-gatherers. By the time Egypt fell to Rome, the Greeks had developed philosophy and democracy, the Romans had built their empire, Buddhism had spread across Asia, and iron had replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons. The Nile River was the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile since ancient times, a phrase attributed to the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE. Without the Nile, Egypt would be entirely desert, part of the vast Sahara that stretches across North Africa. The river provided water for drinking, irrigation, and transportation. But most importantly, it flooded predictably every year, depositing rich, fertile silt on the land along its banks. This annual inundation, caused by heavy rains in the Ethiopian highlands far to the south, began in June and peaked in September. As the flood receded in October and November, it left behind a layer of nutrient-rich black mud perfect for growing crops. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, meaning the Black Land, referring to this fertile soil, as opposed to Deseret, the red land of the surrounding desert. The regularity of the flood was crucial. Unlike the unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile's flood came at the same time every year, allowing farmers to plan their agricultural calendar with precision. The flood season, called Akhit, was followed by Peret, the growing season, and then Shemu, the harvest season. This three-season calendar, each season lasting 4 months, structured the entire Egyptian year. The predictability of the Nile created agricultural abundance. Egyptian farmers could typically grow enough food to support not just themselves, but also a substantial non-farming population: priests, scribes, artisans, soldiers, and laborers who built the monuments. This agricultural surplus was the foundation of Egyptian civilization, enabling the development of art, architecture, writing, and all the other achievements we associate with ancient Egypt. The pyramids were built as tombs for pharaohs. The most famous pyramids, those at Giza, were built during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, around 2580–2560 BCE. The Great Pyramid, built for Pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, is the largest, originally standing 146.5 meters tall and containing approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. For over 3,800 years, it was the tallest human-made structure on Earth, not surpassed until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the 14th century CE. The pyramid was not built by slaves, as popular imagination often assumes, but by a rotating labor force of farmers who worked on the pyramid during the flood season when their fields were inundated and they couldn't farm. Recent archaeological discoveries have found the workers' villages near the pyramids, complete with evidence of their diet. They were fed well with bread, beer, and meat. Their medical care bones show healed fractures, indicating medical treatment and their living conditions. The workers were organized into crews with names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkora, suggesting a sense of pride in their work. The pyramid's construction required sophisticated engineering and organizational skills. The limestone blocks were quarried nearby, while the granite for the king's burial chamber came from Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south, transported by boat on the Nile. The blocks were dragged on sledges, possibly lubricated with water to reduce friction. Ramps of various designs, straight, zigzagging, or spiral, may have been used to raise the blocks as the pyramid grew taller, though the exact method remains debated. The pyramid originally had a smooth outer casing of white Tura limestone, making it shine brilliantly in the sun. This casing was stripped away centuries ago for building material, leaving the rough stepped appearance we see today. The pyramids were surrounded by extensive complexes, including mortuary temples, causeways, and smaller pyramids for queens. They were part of elaborate religious systems designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife. Hieroglyphics was the writing system of ancient Egypt. The word hieroglyphics comes from Greek words meaning sacred carvings, reflecting the Greek understanding that these symbols were used primarily in religious contexts. The Egyptians themselves called their writing medunetjer, meaning words of the gods. Hieroglyphic writing combined logographic and alphabetic elements. Some symbols represented whole words or concepts, while others represented sounds. There were about 700 to 800 hieroglyphic symbols in common use, though the total number including rare signs reached into the thousands. Learning to read and write hieroglyphics required years of training, making literacy the province of a small elite class of scribes. Scribes held privileged positions in Egyptian society, exempt from manual labor and taxation. They worked in administration, keeping records of harvests, taxes, construction projects, and legal proceedings. The hieroglyphic system was complex enough to express abstract ideas, poetry, religious texts, and administrative records with equal facility. In addition to formal hieroglyphics, Egyptians developed two cursive scripts: hieratic, used for religious texts and administrative documents, and later Demotic, used for everyday purposes. These scripts were faster to write than hieroglyphics, but based on the same underlying language. Hieroglyphic writing was carved on stone monuments, painted on tomb walls, and written on papyrus, a paper-like material made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta. The ability to read hieroglyphics was lost after the decline of ancient Egyptian civilization. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE, carved on the walls of the temple at Philae. After Egypt became Christian and then later Muslim, knowledge of the ancient scripts disappeared. For over 1,400 years, hieroglyphics remained undeciphered, their meaning a mystery locked in stone across hundreds of monuments. The Rosetta Stone made it possible to decipher hieroglyphics. Discovered in 1799 by French soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, the Rosetta Stone is a granodiorite stele inscribed with a decree issued in 196 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy V. The same text is written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic for religious purposes, Demotic for everyday use, and ancient Greek for the ruling class. Because scholars could read ancient Greek, they had the key to deciphering the other 2 scripts. The breakthrough came in the early 1820s through the work of several scholars, most notably the French scholar Jean-François Champollion. Earlier researchers, including the English polymath Thomas Young, had made progress by recognizing that some hieroglyphic symbols represented sounds. Champollion built on this work and made the crucial realization that hieroglyphics was a mixed system. Some symbols represented sounds, phonetic, while others represented whole words or concepts, logographic. By 1822, Champollion had deciphered enough of the system to begin reading ancient Egyptian texts. His breakthrough opened an entire civilization to modern understanding. Suddenly, texts that had been silent for nearly 2 millennia began to speak. Temple walls, tomb inscriptions, papyrus documents, and monumental stele could be read and understood. The discovery revealed not just the names and deeds of pharaohs, but also magical spells, love poems, medical texts, mathematical problems, administrative records, and religious hymns. The Rosetta Stone itself, now housed in the British Museum in London, has become one of the most famous archaeological objects in the world, a symbol of linguistic achievement and the key that unlocked an ancient civilization. Its discovery and decipherment marked the birth of Egyptology as a scholarly discipline. Ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife. This belief permeated their entire culture and drove many of their most famous practices, including mummification and tomb building. The Egyptians conceived of the afterlife as a continuation of earthly life, but in an idealized form. The dead were thought to journey to the field of reeds, a paradise where crops grew tall, the weather was always perfect, and there was no hunger, thirst, or suffering. To reach this paradise, the deceased had to pass through the duat, the underworld, navigating various challenges and dangers. The most crucial moment was the weighing of the heart ceremony, depicted in the Book of the Dead and on countless tomb walls. The deceased's heart, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion, was weighed on scales against the feather of Mad, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than or equal to the feather, the deceased had led a virtuous life and could proceed to paradise. If the heart was heavier, burdened by sin and wrongdoing, it was devoured by Ammit, a fearsome creature part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and the deceased faced annihilation, a second final death. To prepare for the afterlife, the wealthy were buried with extensive grave goods, furniture, clothing, food, drink, jewelry, and even games for entertainment. Tomb walls were decorated with scenes of daily life, ensuring the deceased could magically recreate those activities in the afterlife. Hieroglyphic spells and prayers, later compiled into texts like the Book of the Dead, were included to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the underworld. The Egyptians believed that multiple spiritual components comprised a person. The Ka was the life force, created at birth and sustained by food and drink offerings made at the tomb. The Ba was the personality or soul, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could travel between the tomb and the afterlife. The Ak was the transfigured spirit, what the deceased became after successful passage through the underworld. Maintaining the physical body was essential because these spiritual components needed a place to reside, which is why mummification was so important. Mummification was an elaborate process that took 70 days. The procedure was performed by specialized priests trained in the craft, working in workshops called pernefer, house of beauty or place of purification. The process began by washing the body in water from the Nile and wine. Then came the most invasive step, removal of the internal organs. A small incision was made in the left side of the abdomen, and the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were carefully removed. These organs were dried, treated with resin, and placed in canopic jars, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was left in place. It would be needed in the afterlife for the weighing ceremony. The brain was considered unimportant and was removed through the nasal cavity using a long hook, broken into pieces and pulled out in fragments. Next, the body was covered and stuffed with natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium salts found in dry lake beds. The natron acted as a desiccant, drawing moisture out of the tissues. The body remained covered in natron for about 40 days until it was completely dried. This was the crucial step. Without thorough desiccation, the body would decompose. After the drying period, the natron was removed and the body cavity was packed with linen, sawdust, or aromatic substances like myrrh to restore a more lifelike shape. The body was then anointed with oils and resins, which had antibacterial properties and helped seal the tissues. The wrapping process was intricate and ritualistic. Starting with the fingers and toes, the body was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips, with prayers and amulets inserted between the layers. Different amulets served different purposes. Scarabs protected the heart, the Eye of Horus offered protection and healing, and figures of deities provided divine assistance. The entire process took about 70 days because it aligned with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star Egyptians called Soptit, which marked the beginning of the Nile's flood and symbolized rebirth and renewal. Mummification was expensive, and the quality varied depending on what a family could afford. The wealthiest received elaborate mummification, expensive coffins, and well-appointed tombs. The poor might receive only minimal treatment, perhaps being buried in the hot, dry sand of the desert, which naturally desiccated bodies, producing what archaeologists call natural mummies. King Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered nearly intact in 1922. Howard Carter, a British archaeologist, had been searching for Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings for several years, funded by Lord Carnarvon. On November 4, 1922, Carter's team uncovered a step cut into the rock. Further excavation revealed a staircase leading down to a sealed doorway bearing the seal of Tutankhamun. Carter cabled Carnarvon in England, and 3 weeks later, when Carnarvon arrived, they opened the doorway, revealing a corridor filled with rubble. Another sealed doorway lay beyond. On November 26, Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of this second door and peered in by candlelight. When Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb contained 4 rooms packed with over 5,000 objects, golden chariots, alabaster vases, jewelry, furniture, weapons, musical instruments, board games, food, wine, and clothing. The burial chamber held a series of nested coffins and shrines. The outermost was a huge gilded wooden shrine nearly filling the chamber. Inside were 3 more shrines, then a stone sarcophagus, then 3 anthropoid coffins nested one inside another. The innermost coffin was solid gold, weighing about 110 kilograms. Inside lay the mummy of the young king, his face covered with a gold mask that has become one of the most iconic images of ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh who died around age 1819 and ruled for only about 9 years during the 18th dynasty, circa 1330–1323 BCE. He would have been forgotten except for one fact. His tomb was one of the very few royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings that escaped extensive looting in ancient times. Most royal tombs were robbed within a century or 2 of the burial, their treasures stripped away. Tutankhamun's tomb had been entered by thieves shortly after the burial, but they were apparently caught, and the tomb was resealed. Then, when the tomb of Ramesses VI was cut into the hillside above it about 200 years later, rubble from that excavation covered Tutankhamun's entrance, hiding it for over 3 millennia. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb revealed the incredible wealth buried with Egyptian pharaohs. If this relatively minor king was buried with such splendor, one can only imagine the riches that must have been placed in the tombs of great pharaohs like Khufu, Ramesses II, or Seti, all lost to ancient thieves. The Great Pyramid was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it's the only wonder still standing. The 7 wonders were a list compiled by ancient Greek and Roman scholars of the most remarkable constructions of their time. The other wonders, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria, have all been destroyed by earthquakes, fire, or human hands. The Great Pyramid has survived for 4,500 years and will likely stand for millennia more. Its longevity is testament to the engineering skill of its builders. The pyramid's core was built with roughly cut limestone blocks, but the outer casing was made of fine white Tura limestone, carefully dressed to create smooth faces. The blocks were fitted together with such precision that in many places a knife blade cannot fit between them. The pyramid was aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy. The sides face almost exactly north, south, east, and west, with an error of less than 0.05 degrees. How the Egyptians achieved this alignment without magnetic compasses, which wouldn't be invented for another 3,000 years, is still debated, but they likely used astronomical observations, perhaps sighting on specific stars. The Great Pyramid originally stood 146.5 meters tall, but the loss of the outer casing and capstone has reduced it to about 138 meters today. Its base covers about 13 acres, and it contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. If you broke up the Great Pyramid, there would be enough stone to build a wall about 30 centimeters high and 15 centimeters thick that would stretch from Paris to the equator. The pyramid's chambers and passages are a marvel of construction. The King's Chamber, high in the pyramid's core, is a granite room measuring about 10.5 by 5.2 meters and 5.8 meters high. Its ceiling consists of 9 granite slabs weighing approximately 50 tons each. Above the King's Chamber are 5 relieving chambers, designed to distribute the weight of the pyramid away from the ceiling below, preventing it from collapsing. The so-called Grand Gallery, a corbelled passage leading to the King's Chamber, rises at an angle of 26 degrees, and is about 47 meters long and 8.6 meters high at its tallest point. Its construction technique, overlapping limestone blocks that gradually close the space overhead, demonstrates sophisticated architectural understanding. Pharaohs were considered living gods. The word pharaoh itself comes from the Egyptian para, meaning great house, originally referring to the royal palace, but eventually becoming the title for the king himself. The pharaoh was not just a political ruler, but also the chief priest of all gods, the supreme judge, and the commander of all military forces. He, and occasionally she, as with Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, was believed to be the earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, and upon death, the pharaoh became Osiris, lord of the underworld. This divine status meant the pharaoh theoretically owned all land, all resources, and had ultimate authority over all people. In practice, of course, pharaohs delegated authority to viziers, chief administrators, nomarchs, regional governors, high priests, and military commanders. But the fiction of absolute divine rule was maintained through ritual and propaganda. Pharaohs were depicted in art as perfect physical specimens, regardless of their actual appearance. They wore the symbols of kingship, the double crown combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, the crook and flail symbolizing the king as shepherd and provider of his people, the false beard a ceremonial marker of divine authority, and the uraeus, the cobra on the crown, representing the goddess Wajet, protector of pharaohs. Pharaohs had multiple names and titles. The fivefold titulary included the Horus name, the two ladies' name, referring to the goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt, the golden Horus name, the pronomen throne name written in a cartouche, and the nomen birth name also in a cartouche. For example, Tutankhamun's pronomen was Nebkipparir, meaning Lord of the Forms of Re, while his nomen, Tutankhamun, meant living image of Amun. The pharaoh's daily routine was highly ritualized. He was awakened with hymns, bathed and dressed by priests, and performed religious ceremonies throughout the day. The most important was the daily offering to the gods in the temple sanctuary, where the pharaoh or his deputy, the high priest, would open the shrine, awaken the god's statue, clean and anoint it, dress it in fresh clothes, and present offerings of food and drink. These rituals maintained Mad, the cosmic order of truth, balance, justice, and harmony, which the pharaoh was responsible for upholding. If the pharaoh failed in this duty, chaos would ensue. The Nile might not flood, crops would fail, or Egypt would be invaded by enemies. Cleopatra VII was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She ruled from 51 to 30 BCE, representing the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, took control after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. Cleopatra was actually Greek, not ethnically Egyptian. Her ancestors were Macedonian Greeks who had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Yet she embraced Egyptian culture and was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, speaking it fluently along with Greek and reportedly several other languages. Cleopatra was highly educated, intelligent, and politically astute. She came to power at age 18, initially co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII according to their father's will. The two soon became rivals, and Cleopatra was forced into exile. She regained power with the help of Julius Caesar, who arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey. Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers, and she bore him a son, Ptolemy Caesar, called Caesarion. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra allied herself with Mark Antony, one of the three men who ruled Rome in the Second Triumvirate. Their alliance was both political and romantic. They had 3 children together. Cleopatra's goal was to restore Egypt's power and territory, which had been greatly reduced under the Ptolemies. Mark Antony's goal was to secure Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns. Their alliance brought them into conflict with Octavian, later Augustus, the third member of the triumvirate and Caesar's adopted heir. The conflict culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The two fled back to Egypt. A year later, as Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, Antony committed suicide, believing incorrectly that Cleopatra had already died. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian, but realizing he planned to parade her through Rome in his triumph as a captive, she chose to end her own life. According to popular tradition, she died from the bite of an asp, probably an Egyptian cobra, though some historians question this account. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a province of Rome, and 3,000 years of pharaonic rule came to an end. The wealth of Egypt would now flow to Rome, helping to transform it from a republic into an empire under Augustus. Ancient Egyptians practiced medicine with surprising sophistication. They understood that the heart was central to circulation, pumping blood through vessels throughout the body, a concept that wouldn't be fully understood in Europe until William Harvey's work in the 17th century CE. Egyptian physicians recognized the pulse and knew that its strength and regularity indicated health. They understood the connection between the brain and paralysis of limbs, documented in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the world's oldest surgical document dating to about 1600 BCE, but likely copied from texts 1,000 years older. This papyrus describes 48 cases of injuries, wounds, and tumors, with remarkably systematic diagnoses. For each case, the papyrus provides a title description of the injury, examination procedures, diagnosis, and treatment. Some cases are deemed treatable, others uncertain, and some beyond treatment, an honest acknowledgement of medical limitations. The ancient Egyptians performed surgery, including setting broken bones, treating wounds with sutures, and even attempting skull surgery. They had specialized medical practitioners, physicians, SW&W, magician healers, SAO, and priest physicians who combined medical treatment with magical spells. Medical knowledge was specialized. There were dentists, eye doctors, and physicians specializing in internal ailments. Herodotus wrote that in Egypt, medicine is practiced in a very specialized way. Each physician treats just one disease and not more. Egyptian pharmacology was extensive. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to about 1550 BCE, lists over 700 remedies using more than 800 substances including honey, still used today for its antibacterial properties, willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, garlic antiseptic, and myrrh pain relief. They used honey to treat wounds, and modern science has confirmed that honey has antibacterial properties and can promote healing. They prescribed castor oil as a laxative and used cannabis for various ailments. Some remedies were less effective. Crocodile dung was sometimes applied to wounds, and various animal parts were used in concoctions based more on magical thinking than pharmacological reality. Magic and medicine were intertwined in Egyptian medical practice. A treatment might include both a poultice applied to a wound and a spell recited to invoke divine healing. This combination reflected the Egyptian worldview, which didn't separate natural and supernatural causes the way modern thinking does. The Egyptians developed a sophisticated calendar. They created one of the first solar calendars, with a year of 365 days, only about 6 hours short of the true solar year. The calendar was divided into 12 months of 30 days each. plus 5 additional days, called epagomenal days, at the end of the year. These extra days were celebrated as the birthdays of 5 major gods: Osiris, Horus, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys. The year was divided into 3 seasons of 4 months each, corresponding to the agricultural cycle determined by the Nile's flood. Akhit inundation ran from June to September, Peret growth emergence from October to January, and Shemu harvest from February to May. This calendar worked well for agricultural planning. However, because it was exactly 365 days, and the true solar year is about 365.25 days, the Egyptian civil calendar gradually drifted relative to the seasons, shifting by 1 day every 4 years. The Egyptians were aware of this drift. They tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star they called Soptit, which coincided with the Nile's flood and remained synchronized with the true solar year. But they never adjusted their civil calendar, perhaps because the administrative complications of changing it weren't worth the benefit. It would take about 1,460 years for the civil calendar to drift through all the seasons and come back into alignment with the solar year, a period called the Sothic cycle. In addition to the civil calendar, Egyptians used a lunar calendar for religious purposes. Months began with the new moon, and various festivals were tied to specific phases of the moon. The Egyptians divided day and night into 12 hours each. Though the length of an hour varied by season, daytime hours in summer were longer than in winter because they divided the period from sunrise to sunset into 12 equal parts. This system of temporal hours was used by most ancient cultures. The concept of fixed-length hours, equinoctial hours, wouldn't become standard until mechanical clocks made it practical. The Egyptian calendar was remarkably influential. When Julius Caesar reformed the Roman calendar in 46 BCE, he consulted with Egyptian astronomers. The resulting Julian calendar, with its 365-day year and leap day every 4 years, was essentially an improved version of the Egyptian system. This calendar, with minor modifications, is still used today. The ancient Egyptians built some of the world's most impressive temples. Unlike the pyramids, which were tombs built primarily in the Old Kingdom, the great temples were mostly constructed during the New Kingdom and later periods. The temple at Karnak, dedicated to Amun-Re, is one of the largest religious structures ever built, covering about 100 hectares. Construction began in the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE and continued for over 1,500 years, with successive pharaohs adding halls, pylons, obelisks, and shrines. The hypostyle hall at Karnak, built during the reigns of Seti I and Ramesses II, is a forest of 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows. The central columns are 21 meters tall and 3.5 meters in diameter, with capitals shaped like open papyrus flowers. Walking through this hall, even in its ruined state, conveys the overwhelming sense of divine power and pharaonic authority that the builders intended. The columns and walls are covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions and relief carvings depicting religious rituals, pharaohs making offerings to gods, and military victories. Abu Simbel, built by Ramesses II in Nubia, modern-day southern Egypt and northern Sudan, features 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh, each 20 meters tall, carved directly from the cliff face. Twice a year, on February 22 and October 22, the rising sun penetrates deep into the temple's inner sanctuary, illuminating statues of Ramesses II and the gods Amun-Re and Rehorakti, but leaving Ta, god of the underworld, in shadow. This solar alignment was deliberate. designed by the ancient architects to occur on significant dates, possibly Ramesses' birthday and coronation day, though the exact significance is debated. Egyptian temples followed a standard design reflecting religious cosmology. Visitors approached through an avenue of sphinxes, passed through massive sloped walls called pylons, crossed open courtyards, and entered progressively darker and more sacred spaces. The hypostyle hall, then inner chambers, and finally the sanctuary where the god's statue resided. The floor level rose while the ceiling lowered as you progressed inward, creating a sense of entering a sacred mountain. Only the pharaoh and high priests could enter the sanctuary and approach the god directly. Temples weren't places where ordinary people worshipped. They were the houses of gods, places where priests performed daily rituals to maintain cosmic order. Common people worshipped at small shrines, at home, or during religious festivals when cult statues were carried through the streets in sacred barks, ceremonial boats. Egyptian gods had animal heads or animal forms. This was one aspect of Egyptian religion that Greeks and Romans found strange. While the Greeks had anthropomorphic gods, deities in purely human form, Egyptian gods often appeared as animals or as humans with animal heads. This reflected the Egyptians' understanding of the divine as manifest in nature. Animals displayed qualities the Egyptians associated with particular gods. The falcon's keen sight and ability to soar made it appropriate for Horus, the sky god. The jackal's association with cemeteries made it fitting for Anubis, god of embalming. The ibis's patience and precision in hunting made it suitable for Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. Some major gods appeared in multiple forms. Re, the sun god, could appear as a falcon, as a man with a falcon head, or as a man with a sun disk atop his head. Hathor, goddess of love, joy, and motherhood, could be depicted as a cow, as a woman with cow ears, or as a woman with a sun disk and cow horns. These varied forms weren't seen as contradictory, but as different aspects or manifestations of the deity. The Egyptian pantheon was large and complex, with hundreds of deities. Some were worshipped throughout Egypt, while others were local gods of specific cities or regions. The religious landscape shifted over time. During the Old Kingdom, Re was preeminent. In the Middle and New Kingdoms, Amun rose to prominence, eventually merging with Re as Amun-Re, king of the gods. Different cities had their own creation myths and their own arrangements of gods into families, Ennead, meaning 9 gods, though the number wasn't always exactly 9. The Heliopolitan cosmogony, centered at Heliopolis near modern Cairo, held that Atum created himself from the primordial waters of chaos, Nun, then created Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, who gave birth to Jeb, earth, and Nut, sky, who in turn produced Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. This divine family played out a cosmic drama involving murder, Seth killing Osiris, resurrection, Isis reassembling Osiris, revenge, Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, battling Seth, and judgment, the gods declaring Horus the rightful king. The myth served as the divine template for the pharaoh's role as Horus and his transformation into Osiris after death. The Sphinx is one of Egypt's most enigmatic monuments. The Great Sphinx of Giza, with the body of a lion and the head of a human, lies on the Giza Plateau near the pyramids. Measuring about 73 meters long and 20 meters high, it was carved from a single outcrop of limestone bedrock, probably during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, circa 2558-2530 to BCE of the 4th dynasty, though some researchers argue for earlier or later dates. The Sphinx's face is thought to represent Khafre, though erosion has made this difficult to confirm definitively. Between its front paws is a stele placed by Pharaoh Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty, circa 1400 BCE, over 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved. The dream stele recounts how Thutmose, while still a prince, fell asleep in the Sphinx's shadow during a hunting trip. The Sphinx appeared to him in a dream, promising him the throne if he would clear away the sand that had accumulated around the statue. Thutmose did so and indeed became pharaoh, suggesting the Sphinx was already considered ancient and powerful in the New Kingdom. The Sphinx has been buried by sand and excavated multiple times throughout history. The sand actually helped preserve it. The body was protected while buried, while the exposed head suffered more erosion. The most severe damage is to the face, where the nose is completely missing. Contrary to popular legends, Napoleon's troops didn't shoot off the nose. Drawings from before Napoleon's Egyptian campaign show the nose already gone. The damage probably occurred during the Middle Ages, possibly by iconoclasts who defaced pagan monuments, or simply through natural weathering and human vandalism over millennia. The purpose of the Sphinx is debated. It likely served as a guardian of the Giza necropolis, protecting the pyramids and the sacred sites around them. Some scholars interpret it as a representation of Khafre as Rehorakti, a solar deity depicted as a sphinx in New Kingdom texts. The sphinx faces due east, toward the rising sun, supporting a solar interpretation. In later periods, it was identified with the god Hormakhit, Horus in the horizon, and became an object of popular worship. Egyptian art followed strict conventions for millennia. The famous profile view of Egyptian figures, head in profile, eye drawn frontally, shoulders frontal, torso turning to three-quarter view, and legs in profile, wasn't artistic inability but a sophisticated system of representation. Egyptians drew not what they saw from one viewpoint, but what they knew existed. This aspective approach showed each body part from its most characteristic and informative angle. The eye is most recognizable when viewed frontally, so even profile heads have frontal eyes. Shoulders are widest from the front, so they're shown that way. The legs are clearest in profile. This wasn't naive or primitive art. It was conceptual representation following complex rules that artists learned during their apprenticeships. Egyptian art was also hierarchical. The size of figures indicated their importance. Pharaohs were drawn largest, then nobles and officials, then common people, then children or servants. Gods and pharaohs were shown as eternally youthful, idealized, and perfect, regardless of their actual age or appearance. This wasn't portraiture in the modern sense. These images were meant to be eternal representations, embodying the ideal essence of the subject for the afterlife. Color followed conventions too. Men's skin was typically painted dark red-brown, representing their work outdoors, while women's skin was lighter yellow-brown, suggesting they spent more time indoors. Gods had specific colors. Osiris was green, representing resurrection and vegetation, or black, representing the fertile Nile silt and rebirth. Anubis was black. Amun-Re was blue. These colors had symbolic meanings beyond naturalistic representation. Egyptian art did occasionally break these conventions, particularly during the Amarna period under Pharaoh Akhenaten, circa 1353–1336 BCE, when a more naturalistic style briefly emerged. Akhenaten was shown with an elongated skull, a protruding belly, and feminine hips, features that appear in depictions of his entire family. Whether this represented an actual medical condition or was a stylistic choice, emphasizing the royal family's distinction from ordinary humans is debated. After Akhenaten's death and the restoration of traditional religion under Tutankhamun, Egyptian art returned to its conventional forms, which continued with little variation until the end of Egyptian civilization. The ancient Egyptians made paper from papyrus. The papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, a reed that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, provided the raw material for this writing surface that would be used throughout the Mediterranean world for thousands of years. The process of making papyrus sheets involved cutting the plant stem into thin strips, laying them side by side vertically, then placing another layer horizontally on top. The strips were pounded and pressed together, their natural juices acting as an adhesive. After drying in the sun, the result was a smooth, flexible, and durable writing surface. Sheets could be glued end-to-end to create scrolls of any length needed. Some surviving scrolls are over 40 meters long. Papyrus was expensive, so scribes could erase and reuse sheets by washing off the ink. They wrote with reed brushes, using black ink made from carbon, soot, mixed with gum arabic, and red ink made from ochre iron oxide for headings, titles, or to mark the beginning of new sections. The word paper derives from papyrus, though modern paper, invented in China around 100 CE, is made through a different process. Papyrus production was a significant industry in ancient Egypt and remained so through the Greek and Roman periods. The Greeks imported Egyptian papyrus extensively, and it became the standard writing material throughout the classical world. Papyrus eventually declined in use after the Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, when parchment, made from animal skin and later paper, began to replace it. The last known papyrus document dates to the 11th century CE. Papyrus is a relatively fragile material. It deteriorates in humid conditions, so the vast majority of surviving papyri come from Egypt, where the dry climate preserved them. Tens of thousands of papyrus documents have been recovered, ranging from literary texts, copies of Homer, philosophical treatises, religious texts, to letters, legal documents, tax records, and school exercises. These documents provide invaluable insights into daily life, administration, literature, and thought in the ancient world. Egyptian mathematics was sophisticated and practical. Mathematical papyri that have survived, particularly the Rhind mathematical papyrus, circa 1550 BCE, and the Moscow mathematical papyrus, circa 1850 BCE, demonstrate that Egyptian mathematicians could solve complex problems involving fractions, algebra, and geometry. Egyptian arithmetic was based on a decimal system, with distinct symbols for 1, 10, 100, 1000, and so on up to 1 million. They had no concept of zero as a number, but could represent the absence of something in accounting. Egyptian mathematics was practical, focused on solving real-world problems, calculating land areas after the annual flood, the foundation of geometry, literally earth measurement, computing the volumes of granaries, determining the number of bricks needed for construction projects, and calculating wages and rations for workers. They handled fractions in a unique way, using only unit fractions with 1 as the numerator, like 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. To represent 3, 4, they would write 1, 2 plus 1, 4. The exception was 2, 3, which was common enough to have its own symbol. This system seems cumbersome to us, but Egyptian scribes became highly skilled at fraction calculations, developing extensive tables to aid their work. The Egyptians could calculate the area of triangles, rectangles, and circles. For circles, they used an approximation of pi equivalent to about 3.16, derived by computing the area of a circle as 8d/92, where d is the diameter. This gives a pi value of 256.81, or about 3.16049, impressively close to the true value of approximately 3.14159. They could calculate the volume of cylinders and pyramids. Problem 14 of the Moscow Papyrus even calculates the volume of a truncated pyramid frustum, demonstrating advanced geometric understanding. Egyptian mathematics influenced later Greek mathematics. The Greek mathematician Thales reportedly studied in Egypt, and other Greek mathematicians acknowledged learning from Egyptian sources. While the Greeks developed mathematics into an abstract, logical system proving theorems from axioms, Egyptian mathematics remained practical and problem-focused, but it provided a foundation that later cultures built upon. Beer was a staple beverage in ancient Egypt. It was consumed by everyone, men, women, and children, from the pharaoh to the lowliest laborer. Beer was safer to drink than water, which could carry diseases, because the brewing process involved boiling and the alcohol had mild antiseptic properties. Egyptian beer was different from modern beer. It was thick, somewhat porridge-like, and drunk through a straw to filter out the solids. It was less alcoholic than modern beer, probably around 2–3% alcohol by volume, and was nutritious, providing calories, B vitamins, and other nutrients. Beer was made from barley or emmer wheat. The grain was partially baked into loaves, which were then crumbled into water and left to ferment with wild yeasts. Date juice or honey might be added for flavor and additional fermentable sugars. The fermentation took a few days, after which the beer was ready to drink. It wouldn't keep long, so it was made fresh regularly. Workers received daily rations that included beer. Records from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, where the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived, show that workers received about 4–5 liters of beer per day, along with bread, vegetables, fish, and occasionally meat. The beer provided significant nutrition and hydration during long workdays in the hot climate. Beer had religious significance as well. It was offered to gods in temples and placed in tombs for the deceased to enjoy in the afterlife. The goddess Hathor was associated with drunkenness and celebration, and festivals in her honor involved communal drinking. One myth tells of Re, the sun god, saving humanity from destruction by flooding the land with beer dyed red with ochre. The goddess Sekhmet, who had been sent to destroy humanity, drank the beer thinking it was blood, became intoxicated, and stopped her rampage. Wine was also produced in ancient Egypt, made from grapes grown in the delta and certain oases. But wine was more expensive and associated with the elite. It was used in temple rituals and for special occasions, while beer was the everyday drink of ordinary Egyptians. The Valley of the Kings served as the royal necropolis during the New Kingdom. Located on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, ancient Thebes, the valley contains at least 63 tombs, most belonging to pharaohs, their families, and high officials from the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, circa 1550–1077 BCE. The shift from pyramid building to hidden rock-cut tombs was motivated by security. The pyramids, despite their elaborate internal security measures and remote locations, were all robbed in antiquity. By the New Kingdom, pharaohs sought more discreet burial locations that might escape the attention of thieves. The Valley of the Kings, a remote wadi in the desert cliffs, seemed ideal. Tombs were cut deep into the rock, with multiple corridors, staircases, and chambers. Entrances were hidden and sealed. After the burial, the entrance would be concealed, and workers who knew its location were sworn to secrecy or, according to some theories, killed to ensure silence. Despite these precautions, nearly all tombs in the valley were robbed in antiquity, most within a few centuries of the burial. Tomb robbery was a serious crime, punishable by death, often by impalement, but the riches buried with pharaohs were irresistible. Even the security guards stationed in the valley were sometimes complicit. Trial records from the 20th dynasty document investigations of tomb robberies and the prosecution of the thieves, showing that authorities were aware of the problem but unable to prevent it. The tombs followed a general pattern, a descending corridor representing the sun god's journey through the underworld, a well room, an obstacle for thieves and a symbolic transition, a pillared hall, and a burial chamber. Walls were decorated with texts and images from funerary books: the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and the Amduat. These texts provided spells, passwords, and maps to help the deceased navigate the dangerous journey through the Duat underworld and reach the afterlife. The most elaborate tomb is that of Seti I 19th dynasty, with beautifully preserved painted reliefs covering nearly every surface. The burial chamber's astronomical ceiling, depicting constellations and the passage of night hours, is particularly stunning. The tomb extends about 137 meters into the mountain, one of the deepest in the valley. Ramesses II was one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. He ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE during the 19th dynasty, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. Ramesses came to the throne in his mid-20s and lived into his 90s, outliving many of his children. He had numerous wives, including 2 of his daughters, and estimates of his children range from 48 to 50 sons and 40 to 53 daughters. Ramesses was a prolific builder, constructing or expanding more monuments than any other pharaoh. He built the temples at Abu Simbel, expanded Karnak and Luxor temples, built the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, and founded a new capital, Pi-Ramesses, in the Delta. He also usurped many earlier monuments, carving his name over previous pharaohs' cartouches, a practice that makes it difficult sometimes to determine what he actually built versus what he claimed. Ramesses styled himself as a great warrior. The walls of his temples are covered with depictions of his military campaigns, particularly the Battle of Kadesh, circa 1274 BCE, against the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. Ramesses portrayed Kadesh as a great victory, showing himself single-handedly routing the enemy when his army was ambushed. In reality, the battle was inconclusive, though it eventually led to one of history's earliest surviving peace treaties between Egypt and the Hittites, sealed by Ramesses marrying a Hittite princess. The propaganda value of Kadesh, depicted on multiple temple walls, suggests Ramesses understood the power of controlling the historical narrative. Ramesses' mummy, discovered in the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881, where priests had hidden royal mummies to protect them from tomb robbers, shows he was tall for his time, about 1.75 meters, had red hair, rare in Egypt, possibly dyed with henna, suffered from dental problems, and had arthritis in old age. His mummy has been studied extensively and even traveled to Paris in 1976 for conservation treatment, receiving full military honors as a visiting head of state. Many scholars identify Ramesses II as the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus, though the evidence is circumstantial and debated. The identification partly stems from his long reign, his building projects that would have required massive labor forces, and the timing fitting roughly with biblical chronology, though no Egyptian records mention the Exodus events. Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh who ruled as a man. She came to power around 1478 BCE during the 18th dynasty, initially as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III. Within a few years, she declared herself pharaoh, adopting the full royal titulary and iconography of a male king. She was depicted in art wearing the false beard, the Nemes headdress, and the Shendit kilt, all male pharaonic regalia. In statues and reliefs, she has a male body, though some inscriptions use feminine grammatical forms. This wasn't deception or confusion about her gender, but rather her taking on the role of pharaoh, which was conceptually male regardless of the physical sex of the person holding the office. Hatshepsut ruled successfully for about 22 years, one of the longest reigns of any female pharaoh. Her reign was peaceful and prosperous. She focused on building projects rather than military campaigns, constructing or restoring hundreds of buildings throughout Egypt. Her most famous monument is her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs on the west bank at Thebes. Designed by her architect Senenmut, the temple is a marvel of design with 3 terraced colonnades connected by ramps, integrating the structure with the natural cliffside. The temple's walls depict key events of her reign, including a trading expedition to Punt, possibly modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, or Yemen, that brought back myrrh trees, ivory, ebony, gold, and exotic animals, goods that enhanced Egypt's prestige and wealth. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III took sole control and eventually initiated a campaign to erase her memory. Her cartouches were chiseled out, her statues smashed or defaced, and her name removed from king lists. For a long time, historians thought this was revenge by Thutmose III, angry at being kept from power. More recent scholarship suggests the erasure happened late in his reign, perhaps to resolve the irregularity of a female pharaoh in the succession and ensure a smooth transition to his own heirs by removing the anomalous reign from the official record. Despite the attempted erasure, enough evidence survived for modern archaeologists to reconstruct Hatshepsut's reign. Her mummy was tentatively identified in 2007 through DNA analysis, found not in the royal cache, but in a modest tomb, moved there perhaps by priests during antiquity, along with her wet nurse. The identification is based on matching a tooth found in a canopic jar inscribed with her name to the jaw of the mummy, along with DNA suggesting royal lineage. Egyptian religion underwent a revolutionary change under Akhenaten. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV came to the throne around 1353 BCE and within a few years made a radical break with tradition. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, abandoned the traditional gods, and declared the At, the sun disk, to be the sole god. He closed temples to other gods, disbanded their priesthoods, and confiscated their property. He built a new capital, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, at the site now called Amarna, halfway between Thebes and Memphis. This religious revolution was unprecedented. Egyptian religion had always been polytheistic, with hundreds of gods coexisting. The concept of a single, exclusive god was alien to Egyptian thought. Akhenaten's monotheism, or henotheism, acknowledging one god while not necessarily denying others' existence, anticipated later monotheistic religions, leading some scholars to suggest connections to early Hebrew monotheism, though evidence for direct influence is lacking. The Amarna period saw dramatic changes in art. The rigid, idealized conventions gave way to more naturalistic representations. Akhenaten was shown with an elongated skull, protruding belly, wide hips, and thin limbs, either reflecting a medical condition, perhaps Marfan syndrome or another genetic disorder, or an artistic choice emphasizing the royal family's distinction. Family scenes showed Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti playing with their daughters under the rays of the Aten, which ended in hands offering Ankh symbols representing life. A remarkable departure from traditional royal iconography that showed pharaohs as remote, perfect, and eternally youthful. The revolution didn't outlast Akhenaten. When he died around 1336 BCE, probably succeeded by the short-lived pharaoh Smenkhkare, whose identity and relationship to the royal family remained debated, power passed to the young Tutankhaten. Within a few years, the old order was restored. Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, abandoned Akhetaten, and returned the capital to Thebes, reopened the traditional temples, and restored the priesthoods. Akhenaten was denounced as the heretic king, and his name was removed from king lists. His monuments were dismantled, his city abandoned, which ironically preserved it for archaeology, and his religious reforms erased. The Amarna period became a cautionary tale about abandoning Maat and the proper order of things. Ancient Egyptians domesticated cats. Evidence suggests cats were domesticated in Egypt around 2000 BCE, though cats had been attracted to human settlements much earlier, drawn by the rodents that infested grain stores. Cats earned their keep by controlling rats and mice, protecting stored grain from spoilage and disease. But Egyptians developed genuine affection for cats, keeping them as pets, depicting them in tomb paintings lounging under chairs or eating fish, and even mummifying them for burial. The Egyptian word for cat was mau or miu, apparently onomatopoetic, imitating the cat's sound. The goddess Bastet was depicted with a cat's head or in full feline form, representing protection, fertility, and motherhood. The great cat cult center was Bubastes in the Delta, where an annual festival in Bastet's honor was reportedly one of Egypt's most popular celebrations, drawing hundreds of thousands of pilgrims according to Herodotus. Cats achieved sacred status. Killing a cat, even accidentally, could be a capital crime. Herodotus wrote that when a house fire occurred, Egyptians were more concerned with rescuing the cats than extinguishing the flames, and when a pet cat died, household members would shave their eyebrows in mourning. These accounts may be exaggerated. Herodotus was writing for a Greek audience and sometimes emphasized Egyptian customs that seemed exotic or unusual. But archaeological evidence supports the special status of cats. Cat mummies have been found in enormous numbers. At some sacred sites, vast catacombs were filled with mummified cats, offerings to Bastet. Unfortunately, in the late 19th century, when many of these mummies were discovered, they were often treated as curiosities or even ground up for fertilizer rather than preserved for study, a tragic loss for archaeology. Genetic studies suggest that all domestic cats descended from Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, and that Egypt was one of the primary centers of cat domestication. From Egypt, domestic cats spread throughout the Mediterranean world, carried on ships to control rodents, and eventually around the globe. The Egyptians traded extensively with neighboring regions. Egypt was not isolated, but engaged in complex trading networks with Nubia to the south, the Levant, modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan to the northeast, Libya to the west, and Punt to the southeast. Trade goods flowed in both directions. Egypt exported grain thanks to the agricultural surplus from the Nile, papyrus, linen textiles, gold from Nubian mines, and manufactured goods like jewelry and furniture. Egypt imported cedar wood from Lebanon. Egypt had few large trees suitable for construction. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, prized for its deep blue color and used extensively in jewelry and decoration. Ivory and ebony from Nubia and Punt, incense from Punt and Arabia, copper from Sinai and Cyprus, and tin needed to make bronze from sources still debated by scholars, possibly Afghanistan or Anatolia. These trade networks required diplomacy and sometimes military action to secure. The Egyptians mounted expeditions to Sinai for turquoise and copper. They traded with or conquered Nubia for gold and exotic goods. They established trading posts and diplomatic relations with cities in the Levant. The Amarna Letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence dating to the 14th century BCE, discovered at Akhetaten, reveal the complex international relations of the period. Letters between the Egyptian pharaoh and rulers of Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, and Canaanite city-states discuss marriages, trade agreements, and complaints about late shipments of gold. Trade moved along several routes. The Nile itself was the main highway, allowing goods to move easily between Upper and Lower Egypt. Desert routes connected the Nile Valley with oases and eventually with the Red Sea, where ports facilitated trade with Punt. Overland routes crossed Sinai to the Levant. Egypt's geographic position, connecting Africa and Asia, made it a natural trading hub, and control of trade routes contributed to Egypt's wealth and power. Bread was the staple food of ancient Egypt. The Egyptian diet centered on bread and beer, both made from the same grains, emmer wheat and barley. Bread came in many varieties, with at least 15 different types mentioned in texts. The simplest was made from coarsely ground flour mixed with water and baked, producing a dense, heavy loaf. Fancier breads might include milk, eggs, fat, and sweeteners like dates or honey. Some breads were shaped into elaborate forms, animals, spirals, or geometric shapes for religious offerings or special occasions. Baking was typically done in domed clay ovens heated with wood or dried dung. Flat breads could be baked on hot stones or on the outside of the oven. The bread was nutritious, but had a drawback. The stone mills used to grind grain left grit in the flour, which wore down teeth. Examination of mummies shows that dental attrition was a common problem, even among the wealthy. By middle age, many people had worn their teeth down to the roots, leading to abscesses, pain, and sometimes death from infection. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet included vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, and lentils. Fruit included dates, figs, pomegranates, and melons. Fish from the Nile was common and affordable, eaten fresh, dried, or salted. Poultry, ducks, geese, and pigeons was raised for meat and eggs. Beef was a luxury, expensive, and mostly consumed by the wealthy or at religious festivals. Pork was eaten but considered somewhat unclean, possibly because pigs were associated with Seth, god of chaos. Honey was the primary sweetener. Sugar wouldn't reach Egypt until the Arab conquest. The diet was supplemented with wild game hunted in the marshes and desert: gazelle, antelope, and hare. Wealthy estates had fish ponds and aviaries. Tomb paintings often show lavish banquets with tables piled high with food, servants bringing dishes, and guests being anointed with perfumed oils. These scenes represented the eternal feast the deceased hoped to enjoy in the afterlife, but they also reflected actual celebrations and the importance of food in social and religious life. Egyptian soldiers used advanced weapons and tactics. The Egyptian military evolved over 3,000 years, adapting to new technologies and threats. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egyptian forces consisted primarily of foot soldiers armed with spears, axes, maces, and shields, with bows for ranged combat. These weapons were made of stone, copper, or bronze. Soldiers wore minimal armor, perhaps a leather or linen corselet. The New Kingdom saw major changes. The Hyksos invasion during the Second Intermediate Period introduced the Egyptians to new military technologies, particularly the composite bow, bronze weapons, and most importantly, the horse-drawn chariot. When the Hyksos were expelled around 1550 BCE and the New Kingdom established, Egyptian pharaohs adopted and improved these technologies. The composite bow, made of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, was more powerful than simple wooden bows and had greater range. The chariot transformed warfare. Egyptian chariots were light, fast, and highly maneuverable, typically crewed by 2 men, a driver and an archer. Chariot forces could rapidly flank enemy positions, deliver volleys of arrows, and retreat before heavy infantry could respond. Pharaohs are frequently depicted in chariots, shooting bows at fleeing enemies, emphasizing their role as military leaders. The khopesh, a bronze sickle sword, became iconic of Egyptian warfare during the New Kingdom. Its curved blade could hook around shields and was effective for slashing. Scale armor made of bronze plates sewn onto linen or leather garments provided better protection than earlier armor. By the late period, iron weapons were being introduced, though Egypt lagged behind other Near Eastern powers in iron technology. The Egyptian military was organized and disciplined. Units had standard formations and tactics. Fortifications were built along borders and at strategic locations. Military scribes kept detailed records of troops, supplies, and campaigns. The military offered career opportunities for commoners. Successful soldiers could be rewarded with land grants, gold, and sometimes nobility. Generals and military commanders formed part of the Egyptian elite, and several, including Horemheb at the end of the 18th dynasty, parlayed military success into becoming pharaoh. Egyptian women had more rights than women in many ancient societies. Women in ancient Egypt could own property, engage in business transactions, inherit wealth, initiate divorce, and appear in court as witnesses or plaintiffs. This doesn't mean Egypt was an egalitarian society. It was patriarchal, and men held most positions of power, but women had legal personhood and economic agency uncommon in the ancient world. Women could own houses, land, and slaves. They could manage their own businesses. Women appear in records as sellers of goods, lenders of money, and holders of government offices. Some women reached high positions as priestesses, performing rituals in temples. The title God's wife of Amun in the New Kingdom was an extremely powerful position held by royal women with significant economic resources and political influence. Women from elite families were educated. They could read and write, though scribal positions were generally reserved for men. A few women became physicians, though this was rare. Most women's work was centered on the household and textile production. Spinning and weaving were primarily women's work, and the linen textiles produced in Egyptian households had significant economic value, traded and used for payment. Marriage in Egypt was essentially a contract between 2 people, not a religious ceremony. Marriages were often arranged by families, but evidence suggests personal choice played a role, and romantic love was valued. Love poems from ancient Egypt express feelings remarkably similar to modern sentiments. Divorce was possible for both parties, though the social and economic consequences were generally worse for women. Children of a marriage belonged to both parents, and custody arrangements might be negotiated in cases of divorce. Inheritance followed complex rules but generally favored sons. However, in the absence of sons, daughters could inherit their father's property, and women could dispose of their property as they wished, bequeathing it to their children or other relatives. This legal status meant Egyptian women could be economically independent in ways that were impossible for women in many other ancient cultures, where women were legal minors under the authority of fathers or husbands throughout their lives. The Battle of Kadesh was Egypt's most famous military engagement. fought in 1274 BCE between the forces of Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire under King Muwatalli II. The battle took place near the city of Kadesh in Syria, near the modern Syria-Lebanon border. Both empires sought control of the Levant and its trade routes. Ramesses marched north with an army of about 20,000 men, organized into 4 divisions named after gods: Amun, Re, Ta, and Seth. The Hittites had assembled a coalition force, possibly numbering 30,000 men, including allies from across Anatolia and Syria, with about 3,500 chariots. The Hittites fed false intelligence to Ramesses through captured spies, claiming their main force was far away. Believing this, Ramesses pressed forward with the Amun division, leaving the other divisions strung out along the march route. As the Amun division began setting up camp near Kadesh, the Hittites launched a surprise attack, smashing into the Re division as it arrived. The Re division broke and fled, streaming into the Egyptian camp in panic. The Hittites pursued, and suddenly Ramesses found his camp overrun with enemy chariots, his army disintegrating, and his life in danger. According to Egyptian accounts, Ramesses rallied his personal guard, mounted his chariot, and charged into the enemy, single-handedly turning the tide of battle through superhuman courage until Egyptian reinforcements arrived. In reality, Ramesses was rescued by the timely arrival of the narration, a force of mercenaries or elite troops approaching from the coast. Their arrival on the Hittites' flank caught the Hittites off guard, and the Egyptian forces managed to stabilize the situation. The battle ended inconclusively, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Hittites withdrew to Kadesh, and Ramesses returned to Egypt. Both sides claimed victory. Ramesses had the battle depicted on temple walls throughout Egypt, showing himself heroically routing thousands of enemies. The Hittites wrote letters to their vassals describing how they had defeated Egypt. In truth, neither side achieved their objectives. Kadesh remained under Hittite control, and the Egyptians didn't secure dominance over the region. However, the battle exhausted both empires. About 15 years later, they negotiated a peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in history. Copies were inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. The treaty established borders, pledged mutual defense against third parties, and was sealed by Ramesses marrying a Hittite princess, cementing the alliance. The Book of the Dead was a guide for the afterlife. Despite its modern name, the ancient Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, reflecting its purpose of enabling the deceased to move about freely in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead is actually a collection of about 200 spells, incantations, prayers, and magical formulae meant to assist the deceased in navigating the dangers of the Jewat underworld and achieving a successful afterlife. Not every Book of the Dead contained all the spells. The selection varied depending on what the deceased, or their family, could afford and thought most necessary. Wealthy individuals commissioned custom versions with specific spells and personalized illustrations. Poorer people might purchase ready-made versions with blank spaces where their names could be inserted. The texts were written on papyrus scrolls and placed in the coffin with the deceased. The spells addressed various needs and dangers. Some spells transformed the deceased into powerful beings, birds to fly, animals to escape danger. Some provided passwords and declarations to speak when confronted by guardian demons at the gates of the Jewat. Spell 125, one of the most important, dealt with the weighing of the heart ceremony. It included the negative confession, where the deceased declared all the sins they hadn't committed before the 42 divine judges. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. I have not caused weeping. the Book of the Dead evolved from earlier funerary texts. During the Old Kingdom, pyramid texts were inscribed in the burial chambers of pyramids. These are the oldest religious texts in the world, dating to about 2400–2300 BCE. In the Middle Kingdom, coffin texts were painted on coffins, democratizing access to magical protection previously reserved for royalty. By the New Kingdom, these traditions coalesced into the Book of the Dead, available to anyone who could afford it. Vignettes, illustrations, accompanied the spells. These showed the deceased worshipping gods, navigating obstacles, or transforming into various forms. The most famous vignette shows the weighing of the heart. Anubis, jackal-headed god of embalming, weighs the deceased's heart against Maat's feather, while Thoth, ibis-headed god of wisdom, records the result, and Ammit, the devourer, waits to consume the hearts of the unworthy. Surviving copies of the Book of the Dead, some beautifully illustrated with colorful vignettes, are among the most visually striking artifacts of ancient Egypt. Akhenaten and Nefertiti's family may have included Tutankhamun. The exact family relationships in the royal family during the Amarna period remain somewhat mysterious despite extensive research, DNA analysis, and scholarly debate. What we know, Akhenaten was the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tut. He married Nefertiti, and they had at least 6 daughters. The couple is famously depicted in intimate family scenes, playing with their children under the rays of the Aten. Nefertiti was a powerful queen, depicted alongside her husband in royal scenes more prominently than queens typically were, sometimes even shown smiting enemies, a role traditionally reserved for pharaohs. She may have co-ruled with Akhenaten, or even ruled briefly after his death under the name Neferneferuit, though this is debated. Tutankhamun's parentage was long uncertain. Recent DNA analysis of royal mummies suggests that Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten and another wife, possibly Akhenaten's sister, making Tutankhamun the product of royal incest, a practice that occurred occasionally in Egyptian royal families to keep bloodlines pure and consolidate power. Tutankhamun married Ankhesenamun, one of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters, making her both his wife and possibly his half-sister or cousin. Their marriage produced 2 daughters, both stillborn, their tiny mummified bodies buried in Tutankhamun's tomb. The genetic analysis also revealed that Tutankhamun suffered from multiple health problems, including a bone disorder, possibly Kerhler disease, that would have caused pain and difficulty walking, malaria, and possibly sickle cell disease. He had a club foot and a cleft palate. These conditions, particularly if they were related to genetic issues from inbreeding, may have contributed to his death at a young age. The exact cause of Tutankhamun's death remains uncertain. Theories have included murder, chariot accident, infection from a broken leg, and complications from his various health issues. Ankhesenamun's fate after Tutankhamun's death is unknown. One theory, based on Hittite records, suggests she wrote to the Hittite king asking him to send a prince for her to marry, not wanting to take a servant, possibly referring to an elderly official who became pharaoh after Tutankhamun and may have married Ankhesenamun to legitimize his claim. The Hittite king sent a prince, but he was murdered en route to Egypt, possibly by Egyptian officials who didn't want a foreign king. Whether this princess in the Hittite records was Ankhesenamun is debated, but the story illustrates the complex political maneuvering during this turbulent period. Egyptian astronomy was sophisticated and practical. The Egyptians were keen observers of the night sky, tracking the movements of stars, planets, and the sun and moon. Astronomical observations served several practical purposes: determining the agricultural calendar, timing religious festivals, orientation of temples and pyramids, and navigation. The heliacal rising of Sirius, Sopdet to the Egyptians, was particularly important. This is when the star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon at dawn after a period of being invisible. In ancient Egypt, this occurred around mid-July and coincided with the Nile's flood, making it a natural marker for the new year. The Egyptians divided the night sky into 36 decans, groups of stars that rose heliacally at 10-day intervals, providing a sort of stellar calendar. They identified constellations, though these were different from our modern constellations derived from Greek astronomy. They recognized the northern circumpolar stars that never set, calling them the indestructible ones, and associated them with the afterlife. Souls of the dead who achieved immortality became stars that never died or set. The Egyptians tracked the planets, though they apparently didn't understand that planets orbited the sun. Like other ancient cultures, they saw planets as stars that wandered against the background of fixed stars, hence the Greek name planets, meaning wanderers. Solar and lunar eclipses were observed and recorded, often interpreted as evil omens requiring rituals to avert disaster. Egyptian temples were carefully aligned. Many were oriented east-west so that sunlight would enter and illuminate the sanctuary at specific times, particularly during solstices or equinoxes. The temple of Karnak's main axis is aligned to the winter solstice sunset. The temple of Abu Simbel, as mentioned earlier, is aligned so sunlight reaches the inner sanctuary twice a year. These alignments required accurate astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. Egyptian contributions to astronomy were passed to the Greeks, who acknowledged learning from Egyptian priests. The Greek astronomer Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, built on centuries of Egyptian astronomical observations when he compiled his Almagest, the astronomical text that dominated Western astronomy until the Copernican Revolution. Egyptian medicine recognized the importance of the heart and pulse. The heart was central to Egyptian understanding of physiology. They recognized that the heart was connected to vessels that carried blood throughout the body, and they understood that feeling the pulse provided information about a person's health. The Ebers Papyrus describes the pulse in various parts of the body and relates pulse qualities to different conditions. However, Egyptian understanding of anatomy and physiology was limited by their beliefs and practices. Mummification involved removing internal organs, which should have provided opportunities to study anatomy, but the embalmers were craftsmen, not physicians, and their knowledge apparently wasn't systematically shared with medical practitioners. Moreover, religious beliefs meant that dissection for scientific purposes was likely taboo. The Egyptians thought the heart was the center of intelligence, emotion, and memory, what we would call the mind. The brain, by contrast, was considered relatively unimportant and was discarded during mummification. This is ironic given that the Edwin Smith Papyrus contains observations clearly linking brain injuries to loss of function in specific body parts, suggesting some physicians understood the brain's importance, even if this knowledge wasn't widely accepted. Egyptian physicians recognized diseases of the heart and described symptoms that sound like angina or heart failure. They understood that trauma to other parts of the body could affect the heart. We might interpret this as recognition of shock and circulatory failure, though they understood it in terms of their own physiological theories. The heart's importance in Egyptian thought extended beyond medicine. The heart was the only internal organ left in the body during mummification because it would be weighed in the afterlife. The heart scarab, a protective amulet placed over the incision in the mummy, bore a spell from the Book of the Dead, entreating the heart not to testify against its owner during the weighing ceremony. "O my heart, do not stand up as a witness against me." The Abu Simbel temples had to be relocated in the 1960s. When Egypt decided to build the Aswan High Dam to control flooding, generate hydroelectric power, and provide water for irrigation, it would create Lake Nasser, an enormous artificial lake that would flood a vast region of southern Egypt and northern Sudan, including numerous ancient temples and archaeological sites. The UNESCO-led rescue operation, launched in 1960, was one of the most ambitious archaeological projects ever undertaken. Over 20 countries contributed funds, expertise, and labor. The monuments at Abu Simbel, two massive temples carved into a cliff by Ramesses II, were particularly important. The larger temple featured 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each 20 meters tall, flanking the entrance. The temple extended 63 meters into the cliff. The smaller temple, dedicated to Ramesses' Queen Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, was also impressive, with 6 10-meter-tall standing statues at the facade. Between 1964 and 1968, both temples were cut into large blocks, 1,036 blocks, some weighing up to 30 tons, transported 65 meters up the cliff, and reassembled on higher ground where they would be safe from the rising waters. The work had to be done with extreme precision to preserve the temple's structure and the astronomical alignments. An artificial mountain was constructed around the reassembled temples to replicate the original setting. The entire operation cost about $40 million, equivalent to over $300 million today. The solar alignment of the larger temple, where sunlight penetrates to the sanctuary twice a year, was preserved, though the dates shifted by 1 day due to the slight change in position. The Abu Simbel relocation became a symbol of international cooperation in preserving cultural heritage. UNESCO's involvement led to the 1972 World Heritage Convention, establishing the concept of World Heritage Sites, places of outstanding universal value that should be protected for all humanity. The campaign also raised awareness of the archaeological treasures in Nubia, much of which was inundated by Lake Nasser despite rescue efforts. Archaeological surveys documented thousands of sites, and about 20 major temples were dismantled and relocated, but countless smaller sites were lost beneath the water. The Rosetta Stone is written in 3 scripts. The top section is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The middle is Demotic script, a cursive script used for everyday purposes in the late period, and the bottom is ancient Greek. The stone is a fragment of a larger stele, a stone slab erected as a monument, broken at some point in antiquity. The text is a decree issued by a council of priests in 196 BCE, honoring the young pharaoh Ptolemy V on the anniversary of his coronation. The decree confirms the royal cult, lists the benefactions Ptolemy had bestowed on the temples and people, and establishes that copies should be placed in temples throughout Egypt. Because the same text appears in 3 scripts, scholars had the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. The Greek text could be read immediately, providing a translation. Comparing the Greek to the hieroglyphic text above it allowed scholars to begin matching hieroglyphic symbols to sounds and meanings. The breakthrough required recognizing that hieroglyphics used both phonetic symbols, representing sounds, and logograms, representing entire words or concepts. Jean-Francois Champollion, building on earlier work by Thomas Young and others, realized that the cartouches, oval loops, in hieroglyphic texts enclosed royal names. By comparing cartouches in the Rosetta Stone and other texts to the Greek versions of pharaohs' names, he could sound out the phonetic values of hieroglyphic symbols. By 1822, he had deciphered enough to begin reading other texts. The Rosetta Stone itself was discovered by accident. French soldiers were demolishing an old wall in the town of Rashid, Rosetta, to rebuild a fort when they found the stone incorporated into the wall. A French officer recognized its potential importance and sent it to scholars. When the British defeated the French in Egypt in 1801, the stone became British property under the terms of surrender and was shipped to London, where it has remained in the British Museum ever since. Egypt has repeatedly requested the stone's return, arguing it was taken during colonial occupation and should be repatriated. The British Museum has resisted, arguing the stone is part of World Heritage and accessible to more people in London. The debate reflects larger questions about cultural property, colonial legacy, and where ancient artifacts belong. Regardless of where the physical stone resides, its impact is undeniable. It opened an entire civilization to modern understanding and launched Egyptology as a scholarly field. Imhotep was a historical figure later deified. He lived during the Third Dynasty, serving as vizier, chief minister, to Pharaoh Djoser around 2650 BCE. Imhotep was credited with designing the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first monumental stone building in Egypt and a precursor to the true smooth-sided pyramids that would follow. He was also renowned as a physician, astronomer, and sage. After his death, Imhotep's reputation grew. By the New Kingdom, he was venerated as a patron of scribes. Before writing, students would pour a libation to Imhotep's memory. By the late period, he had been fully deified as a god of medicine and healing, with temples dedicated to his worship. Greeks who came to Egypt identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepius. Sick people would visit Imhotep's temples to seek healing, sleeping overnight in the hope that the god would appear in their dreams and provide a cure or guidance. The process of deifying historical figures was not common in Egyptian religion, but it did occur. Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, an 18th dynasty architect and sage, are the best documented examples. These cases show that Egyptians could recognize and celebrate exceptional human achievement while also believing those individuals had achieved a form of divinity. Despite Imhotep's fame, his tomb has never been found. It's believed to be somewhere in the Saqqara necropolis, near the step pyramid he designed. Its discovery would be one of the most significant archaeological finds in Egyptian history, comparable to finding Tutankhamun's tomb. Several expeditions have searched for it, but the vast extent of the Saqqara necropolis, much of it still unexcavated, and the possibility that the tomb was robbed in antiquity and its location forgotten, have frustrated efforts so far. Egyptian mythology included stories of creation, death, and resurrection. The most important myth cycle concerned Osiris, Isis, and Horus. According to the myth, Osiris was a good king who taught humans agriculture and civilization. His brother Seth, god of chaos and the desert, grew jealous and killed Osiris, cutting his body into pieces and scattering them across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, sibling marriage among gods was acceptable and common, searched tirelessly for the pieces. With the help of her sister Nephthys and the god Anubis, she reassembled Osiris's body, performed the first mummification, and through her magical powers, briefly revived Osiris long enough to conceive a son, Horus. Osiris, however, could not remain in the world of the living and became lord of the underworld and judge of the dead. Isis hid in the marshes and raised Horus in secret. When Horus came of age, he challenged Seth for the kingship. The two engaged in a long struggle involving battles, legal proceedings before the divine court, and various contests and tricks. Eventually, the gods decided in Horus's favor. Horus became king of the living, the role every pharaoh took on, while Seth was relegated to the desert and storms. This myth had multiple meanings for the Egyptians. It explained the origin of kingship and legitimized the pharaoh's rule as the incarnation of Horus. It provided a model for mummification and funeral rites, showing how the dead could be preserved and resurrected. It represented the struggle between order, Osiris, Horus, Maat, and chaos, Seth, Isfit. It explained death and the afterlife. Just as Osiris died and was resurrected to rule the afterlife, so too could humans achieve eternal life if properly prepared. The myth was depicted in art, retold in religious texts, and reenacted in temple rituals. It formed the foundation of Egyptian beliefs about death, resurrection, and the afterlife, influencing funerary practices for thousands of years. Interestingly, despite the myth's importance, no single complete version survives from ancient Egypt. We know the story from fragments in pyramid texts, coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead, from temple inscriptions, and from Greek and Roman authors who retold the story. The most complete version comes from Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris, written in the 1st–2nd century CE, though it includes Greek interpretations and may not perfectly reflect earlier Egyptian beliefs. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, from the pyramids rising on the desert plateau to the temples carved into cliff faces, from the hieroglyphs that recorded everything from love poems to religious spells, from the pharaohs who ruled as living gods to the craftsmen who built their monuments, from the flooding of the Nile that made Egypt possible to the desert that defined its boundaries, from the Book of the Dead guiding souls through the afterlife to the mummies preserved for eternity. 3,000 years of civilization, dynasties rising and falling, kingdoms succeeding one another, but always Egypt, continuous, enduring, recognizable. But here's the thing, ancient Egypt is not separate from you. The knowledge they developed, the innovations they created, the questions they asked, all of these flow down through history to the present. When you write with pen and paper, you're using a technology descended from Egyptian scribes writing with reed brushes on papyrus. When you use a 365-day calendar, you're using a system the Egyptians invented. When you take aspirin for pain, you're using a remedy the Egyptians discovered in willow bark. When you enjoy the companionship of a cat, you're participating in a relationship that began in ancient Egypt. When you ponder questions of life, death, and what comes after, you're wrestling with concerns that preoccupied the Egyptians thousands of years ago. Ancient Egypt reminds us that civilization is a continuous thread stretching back thousands of years. The Egyptians built monuments intended to last forever, and many have. The pyramids have stood for 4,500 years and will likely stand for thousands more. They preserved knowledge in texts that still speak to us across millennia. They asked fundamental questions about existence, morality, the cosmos, and the nature of time. They created beauty in art, in architecture, in poetry and music that still moves us today, and they were people fundamentally like us. They loved their families, mourned their dead, celebrated births and marriages. They worked, played games, told jokes, worried about their health, complained about taxes. They fell in love and wrote poetry about it. They faced the same existential questions we face. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? They answered these questions differently than we might, embedded in their own time and culture. But the questions themselves are eternal, human questions that connect us across time to the ancient Egyptians who pondered them while watching the Nile flow past, just as it still flows today. Egypt's monuments stand as a reminder that human achievement can transcend individual lifetimes. The people who built the pyramids, carved the temples, painted the tombs, and wrote the texts are long dead, but their works remain, testifying to what humans can accomplish when they organize, cooperate, and dedicate themselves to something larger than themselves. Every block placed in the Great Pyramid, every hieroglyph carved in a temple wall, every spell written in the Book of the Dead represents human effort, human creativity, human hope for immortality, and in a sense, they achieved it. We remember them, we study them, we marvel at what they built. The pharaohs sought eternal life in the afterlife, but they found a different kind of immortality, living on in history, their names and deeds recorded and remembered for thousands of years after their deaths. If you're still awake, there are more videos waiting. But if sleep found you somewhere along the way, then this worked exactly as it should. Rest well, knowing you're part of a civilization that stretches back thousands of years, connected through an unbroken chain of human culture, knowledge, and achievement to the people who lived along the Nile when the pyramids were young. See you next time.